Good afternoon and welcome. Uh, it's really special to begin this year with this event and this very, very relevant talk. On behalf of Sir J.J. College of Architecture, the Goethe-Institut, Architecture Foundation, the Urban Design Research Institute, the Charles Correa Foundation, I welcome you all to this lecture by Professor David Fixler on a very, very important topic, which is the global renewal of modern heritage. This is a topic that has been on the back of our minds, all of us who value both our city, who have this great desire to learn more about history, and about architecture and its practice in current times. This is a subject that is an inevitable thing that is bound to happen, and that is that the buildings that are from our time or just a little earlier than that will soon reach a stage where they need to be looked at in order to conserve them, extend their life, and extend their use for people to come. This will be especially true for the architecture of the modern movement, which brought with it new materials, construction techniques, RCC, steel, glass, and other such materials, which now, as the buildings age, will require very, very sensitive intervention so that good restoration can happen. Dr. Fixler will definitely tell us about the examples and work that he has done. And some of the buildings are some of the most famous buildings that we can imagine. They are the kind, very literally, that we teach in a history class, as examples of great modern architecture. And seeing their lives extended means that we can visit them and people who come after us can visit them and, revel in that moment in time when these kind of buildings could in fact come up. Today they have got normalized in terms of construction techniques and materials and lead to a certain level of ordinariness, if I may put it that way, that is there all around us, that makes up our urban landscape. But it requires us to preserve moments, buildings, objects, materials in time that are very, very special to us. These are obvious things. I raise this point because in our in our country, in our part of the world, or in our moment in time, these very ordinary things are in fact not really being talked about. We seem to have different approaches to things. Okay, our sense of history is literalist. Our sense of history kind of betrays a lot of agendas, and those are normally seen not in the act of restoration, but in the act of wholesale demolition. We have seen that time and again in the recent past with great sorrow, if I may say that. Some of the most wonderful examples of modernism in architecture in India are no longer there. I'm sure, any government, that really any government worth its salt who had the sensitivity would probably have approached Dr. Fixler long ago to look at probably the most important building in this country that needed to be restored, the Raj Rewal's Pragati Maidan, the buildings on the Hall of Nations. Okay, but here is the sad story. That building itself has been flattened so that its real estate can be converted to something more useful for today. This is just one example. Okay, we have the examples of buildings in Delhi which have undergone the same fate. There is an ongoing controversy about the IIM Ahmedabad and the buildings that Louis Kahn built after the earthquake, I think, of 2002, when a lot of cracks had developed upon it. It's right from that time that, you know, talk has been going on about how to take care of these buildings. And of course, today you hear that no, those buildings are no longer relevant to the current times, and it would be better to replace them with more modern, not modern, but more contemporary blocks. So we face this slight difference in the approaches to the modern heritage that we possess. And we possess some of the most excellent examples of modern heritage comparable with buildings all over the world. Our approach to them, unfortunately, seems different. However, what we can definitely hope for is through the lecture that Dr. Fixler gives us, through his insights and wisdom, we can perhaps develop better ways of looking at the subject, maybe even provide better arguments so that this kind of thing does not continue in the future, and we really look at preserving the architecture of, say, post-independence India. Bombay, as a special example of this period of modernism, is also special not so much for post-independence buildings, but for the buildings that came 20 years prior to that. Buildings that were built in Bombay right from the mid-30s are the buildings that are most constantly occupied right to this day. And they are the buildings, I think, which will sooner or later need to be looked at because they are built in concrete, they have expressions of glass, they have steel in them, and so on. So there is very much a relevance, there is very much a background and environment to this lecture that Dr. Fixler, I hope, will deliver to us shortly as the first event in the new year in our college. And I am so glad to welcome him to this, to our college. So thank you so much for coming. I'll just briefly introduce you, if I may. Oh, okay. I would also like to thank Rahul Mehrotra and Kirtida Unwala for joining us today, for being part of a panel discussion after the lecture is done, and I will introduce them at that time. But before I hand over the reins, Dr. Fixler, let me just briefly introduce him to all of you. David Fixler, Principal of DF Architecture, Planning, Preservation, is a lecturer in Architecture, Urban Planning and Design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He is an internationally recognized leader in the field of historic preservation with a focus on buildings of the mid-20th century. His projects include buildings designed by modern movement masters, including Alvar Aalto, Louis Kahn, and Eero Saarinen. David is a design excellence peer review architect for the United States General Services Administration and has his design and written work published internationally and has lectured extensively all over the world. David, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that very gracious introduction. And I do want to make one small correction. Officially, I'm not a doctor. Just, I don't have a PhD. But nonetheless, I come from a family of scholars and like to exercise my scholarly bent. I want to start by just telling you that there's way more that I would like to talk to you about tonight than it's going to be possible. So I have to make some choices. So I'm going to give you a kind of general overview of the field, of the conservation of modern heritage and talk about a few key examples, most of which I was involved with, but I'm going to show a couple things that I did not as well. It's not a technical lecture. I do lectures on glass and concrete and that sort of thing, but that's for another time. And I do want to also, before I get started, offer thanks to, whoops, that doesn't like me. To offer thanks to my gracious host. Thank you to Rahul Mehrotra for enabling this, and welcome all of you who are not present in the room right now, but are viewing this over live stream. I hope I come through clearly, and I hope you all enjoy the lecture. So, this is a place I like to begin because it says a number of things. First of all, it's a very important early modern building. It is as iconic a building as exists of the early modern movement. It's, of course, the Corbusier Villa Savoie in Poissy, outside of Paris. But it's also the first building to be sort of treated as an object of heritage. And it was none other than Le Corbusier himself who in the late 1950s saw the building degenerating into the state. You see it in the little snippet from Bernard Tschumi's book there on the left, and falling into ruin. And he said, well, we can't let this happen. You know, this is an important piece of heritage, which of course, if one looks at the polemic of Le Corbusier as a young architect, would be a rather strange thing to be saying. But nonetheless, that is, if you like, sort of the beginning of an awareness about this being a heritage and a unique heritage, and a heritage that deteriorates rapidly. But it's also about the fact that in the end, we are looking in the work that we do on these buildings and on these precincts and cities, we're looking for an essence. And that essence is what is revealed, I think, in what Bernard Tschumi is saying here with the idea that the most architectural thing about this building is the state of decay in which it is. You know, all of if you like, the use value has come out of this, and it has been reduced to a kind of an empty architectural shell, which has to stand on its own as a work of human creation, and in its own way as a monument. Now, shortly thereafter, in the early 1960s, the French Ministry of Culture decided that Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation, which at that time was only 12 years old, should be a listed structure. And that thus began the process of actually listing modern architecture. And pay note to the fact that it was only 12 years old, because typically you will find, as you probably have, any of you who have encountered the charters and standards that by which conservation architects and planners work, know that you usually wait for about a 50-year period to achieve that level of significance, to make sure that it's really something that is legitimately going to be historic. Modern architecture changes all this because of the wear and tear that happens on these buildings and the fact that many of them just simply were not durable. And you had to make the choice early on if you wanted to save it. So let's make sure that we understand basically what we're talking about. We have a kind of a common lexicon of what this modernism and modernity is. It's about three broad categories: society, technology, and aesthetics. And I'm going to show you three examples of buildings that I'm quite familiar with that illustrate these, I think, but also illustrate preservation or conservation lessons at the same time. First of all, this is the Kiefolk Housing Estate by J.J.P. Oud in Rotterdam. And of course, housing was one of the key drivers of the early modern movement. Housing and health. It was all about uplifting the condition of the European proletariat. This is really what began, and really the global proletariat, because it very quickly became a larger movement than just in Europe. But, and this is the kind of housing that was built. This is circa 1930, but in the, bearing in mind what I just said about durability, these buildings by the 1990s were literally falling apart. They were made of a substandard concrete masonry unit which was crumbling, and they were basically had become condemned by the Dutch government as being uninhabitable. Well, an interesting debate ensued at that point, because what they decided they would do is recreate this. And for any of you who know anything about the Dutch and this kind of thing, the last thing they want to do is try to be cute about how they are treating their heritage. They want it to be honest, they want it to play by the rules, and the rules would say, you do something different probably, because this is gone, you can reconstruct it, but you're fooling people. And if you're being perfectly honest, you would do something to change it. Well, the fact is, what they did do is they replicated the exterior appearance, but they completely rebuilt the insides to modern space standards, because standards for apartments in the 1920s are not the same as what people would accept for standards in the 1990s. So it was rebuilt, and it's quite nice to walk around. And if you don't know the history, you probably do think it was built in 1930. So I'll leave that question with you as to how you view this, but it certainly, it has reinforced and reestablished a very interesting early modern neighborhood in Rotterdam. Technology. The expression of use and expression of technology in early modern architecture and throughout the course of modern architecture and still today is very prevalent. This is the Van Nelle factory, also in Rotterdam, also from about 1930 by Brinkman and Van der Vloot. And it is particularly well known for these glass and steel tubes and for being one of the earliest uses of a monumental glass and steel curtain wall. And this building, the sort of expression of the technology about this building is really its major character defining feature. But of course, given the fact that you have acres of single pane glass and steel in a northern climate where it gets very cold, and still pretty hot, but very cold certainly, this building, which was originally built for the bulk goods distribution, tobacco, coffee, things like that, was converted into a startup facility for design firms, graphic design firms, small technology startups, that sort of thing. So it, in effect, was transformed from what was the central economy of the 1920s to the central economy of circa 2000. And what they did was they built a building inside the building. So they were able to retain the curtain wall and still have well-tempered space and be much more environmentally sustainable. And you have this sort of in-between space, which is okay for circulation and for casual encounter and that sort of thing. But it's never conditioned to the degree that the building within the building has done so. So there again, it offers a lesson about renewal that I think is very important. It goes along with that. And finally, on the, aesthetics cover a very wide range of subjects, but certainly a prime example of an aesthetic symbol of the early modern movement is Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion. But of course, this was an exhibition pavilion. It was up for the 1929 Barcelona exhibition, and then it was taken down. And some 60 years later, the Spanish government and the city of Barcelona decided that they wanted to rebuild this. They wanted to, in the same sort of spirit, as you like, of the housing that I just showed you, to recreate this in a way that would attract tourists, which it has. And again, it's a marvelous thing. I've been there several times. It certainly shows the principles that Mies espoused, although we don't know that it's exactly what it was, because there weren't a lot of detailed drawings. There were just a lot of very good photographs and some drawings. But it's, again, the notion here is this done really in the spirit of what the modern movement was all about? Because in a way, that spirit is embodied in the charters that people used to follow this work. The Venice Charter, the Secretary of the Interior standards in the United States, and even the narrow document on authenticity in the Bora Charter, which we'll talk about in a minute. They all follow, they all talk about differentiating when you are doing something new. It is a modern idea. I mean, in a way, conservation as a discipline is part of the modern movement because it's a clear other to the new movement that was being promulgated. So it's just something to think about. And brings up the question, is modernism different? Is it really different than working on structures of any period? Many of the same rules apply, but I think that there's the balance between conservation of material and retention of an idea sways more towards the idea side in modern architecture because the materials are harder to conserve. Most of them don't require patina. Most of them, they deteriorate fast, and they often can't be restored. They have to be replaced because they're an industrial material. The value of change, the idea that modernism was about dynamism. It was about things that are going to change and anticipating change. And many of the great buildings of the early modern period were meant as transitory buildings, and people now are trying to save them, and with good reason. But that wasn't their original purpose. They weren't buildings for the ages. They were buildings to serve a particular purpose at a particular time. The importance of technology, just kind of went over that, but the idea that you're celebrating that and celebrating technical advances when you go into to restore these buildings and making use of that for the best expression is important. And then backing up to the idea of newness value as something that people look at in a building that is much more true with a modern building than with, say, a building built of aluminum, glass, and concrete than it would be in a traditional building built of wood and masonry, where as that building ages, it sort of seasons and acquires this layer of patina, which the glass, aluminum, and concrete building is not going to do in the same way. And then in terms of designing interventions, you have temporal and aesthetic proximity, the idea that the way we design now, what our language, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is very close to the language of the original modern masters in many cases. And we are relatively close in time. So again, that issue of being distinctive and what is original, what is new, should there be a marked distinction between the two, or can you blend them at times? These are all things to be considered. Challenges. The first is just that there's a lot of it. I mean, there was so much built and continues to be built because, I mean, one of the things that is coming to the fore more and more with people who work on mid-century buildings is we're being asked more and more to look at later 20th century buildings and even early 21st century buildings because they age quickly. And so that's, you know, you're dealing with a vast corpus of building. Balance of character, retention, and the improvement of performance. Again, I think that's fairly obvious. And this particular comes into play when you're talking about very delicate single glazed curtain walls that really are horrible energy hogs. And you want to try to make them as robust as possible, but you are going to, you're going to have to, in most cases, take a lot of that material away and replace it with something new that inevitably is not going to look exactly the same. The educational challenge, sort of bringing people around, and I'm glad to say that since the time that I first used this particular slide, I think the educational challenge is improving. I think people are warming more and more to the idea that this is in fact heritage and that we do, not everybody, and that we do in fact need to honor and appreciate it. And now, but many of these buildings lacked a certain sort of human scale in some areas. These are particularly the works of what we euphemistically call brutalism, but certainly raw concrete buildings that don't always recognize and acknowledge a sort of fine-grained streetscape and human scale at the interface between the building and the environment. And so that's something, that's an area of change that often has to be priorities in these things. And then, of course, functional and programmatic obsolescence. These are, you know, there is some truth to Louis Sullivan's dictum of form follows function in the sense that many modern buildings were really designed to a bespoke program, and Their form was meant to fit just that program. So if you go change it, if you're altering it dramatically in any way, you're not dealing with a generic building. You're dealing with something that had a very particular form for a particular reason. And sometimes it's harder to fit that in. Then there are, of course, the technical challenge. And I think rather than reading through that, there's too many bullets to read through. But I think there are lots of technical challenges that are involved with this. But I think that it drives us forward. It makes us think hard about what's really important here, and it's frankly helps foster innovation. I think that it isn't, in a way, there's more of a challenge to bringing a good mid-century building back than there is to building a new building from scratch. And I think more and more people are realizing from an environmental standpoint that given the fact that we can't just keep demolishing buildings, throwing them away, and putting up new buildings everywhere, but we have to work with what we have and make as intelligent a reuse of it as we possibly can. I did say global. So I want to start to talk about some South Asian and Latin American examples of the kinds of things that are being addressed now in the renewal of modern heritage. There you see, of course, you all know Chandigarh, which was begun. Actually, it was first commissioned in the late 1940s, right around the time of independence, and in 1947. And but Le Corbusier was hired in the early 1950s and really sort of gave it the final form that it is now. There are a number of buildings here that have been worked on, that conservation work and conservation planning is being done on. But I think it's certainly safe to say that this is probably the largest site, single site of modern heritage in South Asia. And it's going to be years sort of not only working on, again, on the renewal, but accommodating the change, accommodating the great influx of people. I mean, years and years ago, we were already being shown images of these sort of ad hoc developments that happened throughout the city. And I think the idea is not to clear that out and make it look like it was when Le Corbusier first designed it. The idea is to say, how do we integrate this stuff into this city while leaving the sort of monumental city to the expression that it deserves? Modern architecture begins relatively early here in India, and this is the Golconda Sri Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry. Not a building I personally know well, but certainly a very important building and a building I'm dying to see. And it was built by Antonin Raymond, who was an American architect who had expatriated to Japan. George Nakashima, who was a Japanese architect who eventually repatriated to America. Francois Sammer and Chandrulal Shah. This is an early example of the use of operable louvers to be able to modulate something, this ancient idea, but the modern movement really grabbed onto this and used it in very many buildings, especially in this early phase when there was not air conditioning. You have, for instance, the Ministry of Education in Rio de Janeiro, the first executed modernist high-rise structure. And those same louvers are found throughout the administrative buildings in Brasilia, and are again, they keep these buildings well enough shaded and sufficiently habitable that they can be used throughout the year without air conditioning, although most of them are being retrofitted with air conditioning anyway. There's a lot of serious heritage in Brazil. World Heritage Site was recently inscribed for the Pampulha Ensemble in Belo Horizonte by Oscar Niemeyer. Niemeyer was a very young architect at this point in 1940, and did an interesting series of about half a dozen buildings around the lake, which has been brought together and given this World Heritage designation. It's an eclectic ensemble, and it's sort of, I don't know exactly how to put it from a use standpoint, but they include a residence, a yacht club, a casino, and a church. So, and they're all very, very interesting buildings. On a larger scale, Brasilia, like Chandigarh, was a capital city, although in this case the capital of the whole country of Brazil rather than just a province. Those buildings I was just mentioning are, if you can see my cursor, right, those are the ministry buildings. There are 6 on each side, and they all use that same system of operable louvers. But this is also a World Heritage Site, and World Heritage inscription means you have to play by certain rules in terms of what you do to renovate your buildings, because what they are primarily concerned about is keeping what's important about these sites important and really not changing them. So change has to be extremely carefully managed if you want to stay on that level. I once gave a series of lectures in this building, which is the School of Architecture in Brasilia. And it's part of what's called the Minha Grau, which is the Great Worm. And what fascinated me about this building was the way in which these concrete beams, which kind of end in nowhere, you can see there's rebar coming out of the top of the column, like Leon Creer's 6th Order of Architecture there. But it's kind of in a semi-ruinous state and is being overgrown with vines and that sort of thing, but it's very poetic. And in a similar way to what Balkrishna Doshi did here at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore, although this, in fact, was finished and doesn't have the raw concrete rods sticking up. But there is also this kind of inside-outside quality and a very poetic relationship with nature that I appreciate very much with this. Doshi, of course, needs no introduction to you. He worked with Le Corbusier on this building, the museum at Chandigarh, and he was a collaborator early on there in the 50s before going off on his own in the later 1950s. And he, of course, did the School of Architecture in Ahmedabad. This building here, which I think we can say owes something to the museum that he had done with Le Corbusier, but very much in his own way and his own hand. And these are all buildings that have been recognized in one way or another by organizations that sort of monitor the quality and progress of these buildings. This is, again, from Sept, a drawing of Doshi's and the actual realized stair there on the right. Also want to mention an early work of Charles Correa. Here, the Gandhi Smarak Sangrahalaya in Ahmedabad. And this is a building that I think it's pretty clear that Mr. Correa was familiar with Louis Kahn's Trenton Bathhouse, which also is a series of pyramidal roof pavilions. But one of the things that's interesting to look at here, it's a very simple building like Kahn's Bathhouse. Both of them don't have glass windows, they just have openings. But if you look carefully, the image on the left, which was taken after the image on the right, you can see that the concrete surround there, the supporting concrete for the roofs, is painted, whereas on the right, it is still left in its natural state. And there's a tremendous difference in concrete between, once you paint it, there's a level of depth and variation and kind of life, if you like, to the material that disappears. And you may choose to paint it in certain areas as accents, but I think it's more often than not, it takes away from the quality of what the concrete can mean for the structure to do that. So it's something to be cognizant of. Charles Correa's stadium in Ahmedabad is the subject of a Getty Conservation Institute Keeping It Modern grant and is on the World Monuments Fund's watch list. It is a building that needs work, but I think we can probably safely say is going to be well protected. But it's, again, a very muscular concrete building, and I think this shows very well, and both in this image and this wonderful shot on the inside as you're coming out towards the pitch, the quality of what good concrete can, and even concrete that doesn't necessarily even have to be of the greatest quality, but it does have a certain poetic about it that I think is important, and it should be, because I mean concrete, I don't know if you know, but it is the most ubiquitous substance on the planet after water. There is more concrete than there is of anything else on the planet except water. So, and unfortunately, it's not the most environmentally friendly material to produce, but there's a lot of work that's being done now to try to find ways in which this can be done in a way that does use less energy and less carbon to make for something which otherwise is certainly extremely useful. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times the Getty Conservation Institute. They, since 2012, 13 maybe, I guess is when the colloquium was, have been developing this Conserving Modern Architecture initiative, which I've been involved in different ways at different times since the beginning. I'm doing some lectures for them now. But they give out, one of the things they do is give out these Keeping It Modern grants, which the Stadium in Ahmedabad got, and which another building, this one, by the Gandhi Bhavan, by Le Corbusier's cousin Pierre Jeanneret, was also the recipient of a Kim grant. And what these are all about is really instilling a systematic way of going about the analysis of these sites. Most of these grants are not for construction. They are for study. They're for conservation management planning, or they're for particular sort of detail level material tests so that they can understand that they can develop better techniques, particularly on concrete, to make these buildings last longer. They extended around the world. This university in Ife, Nigeria, by Ariel Sharon was a recipient of a Kim grant, and it's a program which they've stopped doing, but there are other things that are coming in and sort of taking its place and trying to use as much energy to propel this forward. There are losses. There have been some notable losses, such as this. This is, of course, the Hall of Nations in New Delhi by Raj Ruwal and Mahendra Raj, which only lasted from the early 1970s until 2017 before it was taken down. And there you see the building on the left and the demolition on the right. And this is it's about change in perception, obsolescence, wanting something that's the new and latest and greatest. I don't really know all the reasons why this was taken down, but certainly in terms of the loss of a unique artifact of modern heritage in South Asia, it's significant. It's sort of too bad. Now, a at least provisionally better ending so far exists for this. The Kamalapur railway station in Dhaka in Bangladesh, which was designed by an American engineering firm named Lewis Berger Associates. Daniel Dudham and Bob Rui were the particular engineers that designed these wonderful, they're sort of a blown up concrete version of a Muqarnas vault. And which is of course a traditional Islamic architectural motif. And but blown up to this huge, gargantuan scale, which makes for a very powerful expression, and again talks about the kinds of very innovative things you can do with reinforced concrete. I'm going to mention very briefly the Indian Institute of Management, because you really can't talk about South Asian architecture today and not mention it. But on the other hand, I also understand that this is an extremely complex issue, that work has been done on the complex over the years, and that I'm not passing judgment, let's say that. There's certainly wonderful buildings. Louis Kahn was a wonderful architect, and I only hope that there is some amenable solution that can be arrived at that satisfies both the people who run these buildings and take after them for the university, and the international cultural community that would like to save them. Very wonderful series of buildings, and this is a wonderful set of photos that I found by Kamal Emden, and they're in black and white, and they really show it, I think, at its most poetic. So we can just hope for the best ending possible there. So to round out this portion, what we're looking for with all of these buildings is not just what they are and what they represent, but look for opportunities to tell a story about the architecture, about the institute, whatever they are, whatever it is that resonates with the building's users and with the admirers from afar who want to see these buildings preserved. You honor, you interpret, and you interpolate so that you can devise a platform on which to develop this. And then you be bold and informed. And again, the idea that this is the sustainable approach, that more and more and more, I'm finding my students at Harvard who come to me saying, we want to do more to perpetuate buildings. And there are more and more studios being given not as preservation studios. It's very important to understand this is not just about conservation. It's about taking the buildings and finding some good new use for them. So it can be a fairly radical approach, perhaps, but that is I think something we're going to see a lot of in the immediate future is more and more ways to go about this. An organization, international organization that you may not be familiar with, or I hope you are, is Docomomo International, which is in, I think, about 80 or 85 countries around the world, including India, and really looks after modernism, both from the point of view of the scholarly, the advocate, and the technical, which is nice because usually when an organization does one thing or the other, but they really bring all this together. And one tangible product that Docomomo New England did in consortium with the city of Boston, near where I live, is this complex by I.M. Pei and Partners, the Christian Science Center, getting it landmarked and getting it protected because there were some awful things that they were going to be doing with this. And it's a very important work, large-scale work of modernist urbanism. And we have, and we successfully negotiated a reasonable compromise so that they could do development around the site and not actually disturb it. This is the Docomomo India Facebook page. If you're not familiar with it, it is. I didn't actually find a website for it, but I did find this. I would encourage you to go on it and see what's up. Other organizations that are actively involved in this include the Association for Preservation Technology. These are the covers of 2 special issues on modernism that I edited at different times. And they, again, of course, being the Association for Preservation Technology, while we do deal with the philosophical issues here, it's primarily focused really on technique, and there's an awful lot of very good work being done that can be applied to these buildings around the world. Just a couple of other journals I wanted to make you aware of if you're interested in following up more on this. There's the British-based Journal of Architectural Conservation, Change Over Time, which is a product of the University of Pennsylvania's Department of Historic Preservation, and very interesting scholarly journal. And then the Docomomo Journal itself, the issue on the right being about Louis Kahn and about the renewal of his works around the world. It includes a very good article by Brenda Somaya, who of course is an architect here in Mumbai, on the work that she did at Ahmedabad. So I mentioned the narrow document of authenticity and the Bora Charter. These, along with the Venice Charter, really are they're sort of the real core documents by which conservation practice is guided. And they continue to evolve. And the reason I put these 2 up there is because these are both charters that go beyond simply looking at the built fabric. They get into the cultural and social milieu. They get into intangible elements about significance. They're much broader in terms of their cultural interpretation, and they aren't insistent on the conservation of material as being the be-all and end-all. There's many, many other things to be factored, and that is, as I said, is becoming much more prevalent in working with 20th century buildings. And here, in fact, is the ICOMOS 20th Century Committee, which have come up with their own guidelines. And while this is a very good document and contains a lot of wonderful information, it's still, in a way that the NARA document and the Bora Charter do not, has the aura of John Ruskin, sort of the the sacrosanct idea of the material as being prominent, and more prominent perhaps, I think, than other people looking at these issues may be. And they certainly, out of all this comes a lot of, in the studies comes conservation management plans, such as this one done for the Paimio Sanatorium, one that I did for a building by Paul Rudolph at Wellesley College, these both being recipients of Getty Keeping It Modern grants. So I'm going to move right along here. When you go to intervene in a modern building, as I mentioned, standard preservation or conservation practices, you differentiate. And that's what this Standard 9, this is from the US Secretary of the Interior Standards, which is basically a United States rewriting of the Venice Charter. It's most of the same kinds of things, but it's a little broader and more inclusive. Now here's an example of a project I worked on where it is certainly, this is not a modern building, but you can tell where you can tell what's original and what's new. And there's the old wings on the side, there's the very new piece in the center, and then there are these extended windows that have been punched into the lower level of the side, which are clearly contemporary when you walk up to them, but from a distance kind of blend back. So we tried to strike a balance there between these three. There is an interesting memorandum that has been circulated, again, from UNESCO, called the Vienna Memorandum. And what this is all about is how you build new in heritage environments. And one of my favorite examples of that is this building by Nicholas Grimshaw in Bath. It's a completely intact, virtually, 18th century spa town in the west of England. And they dropped this very contemporary, highly contemporary modern building into the middle of it. But as it started to age, there it is right after it was built. And within a few years, it's already starting to acquire a patina and blend in. And I think that this is an example of a building that's always going to stand out as being something new and different, but it is also becoming, with age, a good neighbor. One of the hardest building types to deal with are these reinforced concrete, muscular, aggressive reinforced concrete structures like Paul Rudolph's Art and Architecture building at Yale University. And one of the things that's particularly challenging about this building is that Rudolph designed a lot in sections. So there are many, many different levels and many, many very tight circumstances that he uses to maximize the sort of compression and release aspect of moving through his building. So in order to bring this building up to code, to make it fully functional, because when you have all these different levels, you have to, in the States anyway, you have to connect them all with ramps or with an elevator. And so in order to accomplish that, they actually built an addition onto the building, which, although it does have a few classrooms, its primary goal is to make the older building functional, to be able to make all those connections across and to give some relief and to provide things like washrooms and that sort of thing. But it's a very difficult thing from the point of view of architectural language. And I think if you look at this, you might agree with me. You can see the original concrete building, on the left, and then on the right, this slightly, I think, kind of tortured addition, which, by the way, was the product of many great architectural minds, maybe too many. But suffice to say, it works. It works. It holds together. And what they did do here, in addition to restoring Rudolph's work beautifully, and to solving all of the internal problems, was they made it a highly sustainable renovation. They worked with a firm called Atelier 10, who work around the world with architects and engineers developing aggressive, sustainable solutions for these buildings. And I'm not going to read to you what all these different things are, but and here's an example, for instance, of how the delivery of air systems goes from fan-driven air to all radiant cooling. I think I've lost the mic again. And so in other words, making this building as good an environmental neighbor as it possibly can be. And there's some of the restoration on the interior. Okay. Now we will turn to Louis Kahn and to the Richards Laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania. So first of all, as a little bit of a reminder on this, conservation, what it's about is the retention and active relationship of these buildings to a community's functioning present. And I'm not going to read you the rest, but you can take that in and just cast your eye down to the end, because what we were able to do in renovating this building was to turn it into the building that Louis Kahn originally wanted it to be. Because initially, what happened was, the Kahn was kept separate from the user group, and he dealt only with the administration, and never really got the message that scientists don't work like architects. He wanted to build, and I will quote, a space that you can divide, no space can satisfy these requirements. I thought what they should have was a corner for thought, in a word, a studio, instead of slices of space. So he thought it should be open, without partitions, and he created this scheme with these big windows that you could see in here, that was designed to promote collaboration, get a lot of light in, all these sorts of things that, frankly, as Vincent Scully, a very famous architectural historian, said, they're a town of colleagues, but in a material sense, they function not perfectly at all. And the reason I quote Scully on this is because he in the same breath, called this one of the greatest buildings of the 20th century. I mean, he absolutely loved the building, but he recognized its shortcomings. And here, this again shows you this dichotomy. On the left, you see Kahn with a model of the building as it was presented at the Museum of Modern Art. And then you see the condition that the building is in today, or was in, I should say, with sort of lighting and services and benches and partitions, just sort of put up helter-skelter in order to try to make the building work. Well, it wasn't really originally planned that way. At least Kahn, wherever he could, was very systematic in managing the distribution of the systems, stacking, layering the different kinds of services, so that when they needed to work on these, they had access to them, and everything went back into an orderly place. But it wasn't really, there were a lot of challenges. Again, I'm not going to read these, you can look at them quickly, but you can see from the image on the left where there's just great compromise, just inability to deal with these particular kinds of spaces because they simply weren't really cut out for the kind of wet bench science that these people were doing. So what we had to do was make the building efficient, to find a way to create a system of adaptive standardization so they could still go in and make the changes that they needed to do, but could do it in a way that was methodical and disciplined, encourage a culture of collaboration, and importantly, switch the big functions from wet science to dry science. In this case, it is a Center for Cognitive Neuroscience, so it's really all about a lot of computation. It's a lot of computers. There's an MRI machine, but there's no big fume hoods and wet banks and that sort of thing. And then finally, respect but improve the building. So these are some of the things that we did as we worked through this. And the introduction of the high-performance laminated glass, that's a whole story in itself, which I'm not going to get into tonight. But there was, between that and the change in the mechanical systems, those were the things that we did to vastly reduce the energy consumption, because we had a mandate from the university from this thing called the Sentry Bomb Project, which funded the building, that said you have to be as aggressive as you possibly can. Okay. So this is in looking at the glazing, we find that the corners, if you look on the right-hand slide there, are kind of bending in and out, and the very crispness of the vitrine-like quality that you see on the left is somewhat lost. And because of that, we had to custom measure each opening. But first, before doing that, we had to go back and really understand what Kahn was after. So these are the glazing details for the building originally. This is a series of diagrams of different solutions he had tried before Richards, with Richards, and after Richards. And then this is my own idea for trying to use an insulating glass unit. And finally, we arrive at the circled center solution with the laminated glass. So this is a very important and very long sequence that we took to get to this. But it proved to people that in order to keep the essence of the framing, which was so important to the look of the building, we had to keep that consistent. And then that all made its way into design guidelines so that even after this work is done, if they have to go back later on, they know exactly what they need to do and how they need to do it in terms of working with either the glazing or the systems. I'll go through this quickly. The programmatic changes were primarily in the green areas, which even though from the outside they are the most expressive, highest degree of significance in the building, from the inside it's really all about it's all about making something work. So what we have here is the original 6th floor plan on the left, and on the right, this plan where you see that there is a space that's been opened up in the center and filled with workstations. And if you look at this, you'll see that there actually where that red circle is what that photograph is. And it is because we have moved partitions off the grid, the original grid that was dictated to sort of take the lines of the structure above, in order to really make this work, in order to provide the openness that Kahn wanted, and to provide equal office sizes, and to provide lots of work for graduate students, lots of areas for graduate students to work. We used contemporary modeling, Navisworks for the systems. We looked at Kahn's precedents for things like the material palette on the left and shifting partitions off of a structural grid on the right. These are actual Louis Kahn buildings, the Yale Center for British Art and the Kimball Art Museum, and created this open space. And you can see the rows of lights going down on either side of the areas where we pushed the partitions back. And in the end, ended up and really made the concrete sing. I have to say that we took a soap and water solution and did it twice on the concrete, and that was enough to just bring out this absolutely beautiful quality, which resonates, and you would never, ever get with painted concrete. You open up views between the buildings that never existed before, so there's a sense of community that is really working there. And finally, the restoration of the entry. And Mr. Kahn, who I hope would be happy with this work. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is Alvar Aalto's Baker House at MIT. And again, this is a truncated version of what is normally a much longer presentation. But Alvar Aalto, I think I'm missing the slide. Okay. Alvar Aalto was hired by MIT right after the Second World War to design the seniors' housing. It was the first time that MIT had built a residence hall since the original campus was built, and it was really MIT's the beginning of them creating a culture of student life, which never existed before at MIT. It was much more like a German university where everybody just found their own place to live and only came together for courses and labs. And they thought that Aalto had a brand of humanism and care about student life and about how people interact with space, that he would be the appropriate architect for this project. And what I'm showing you here is one of the big initial problems that we got to, which was what we wanted to do was to restore this building, really, because it worked very well. There was very little that needed to be changed from a programmatic standpoint. The systems were shot, the lighting was not good, there were a few other things like that. But by and large, it was it worked. It was a success. It was just tired. So what you see there on the left is the entrance to the building, a set of inaccessible steps. And on the right, one of about a dozen models that we built, looking at possible solutions to introduce a ramp off to the side, which you see on the front of the slide on the right, that brings you up onto the level of the main floor of the building. And so we built that, and on the right, what you can see here, we also, from an accessibility standpoint, you can see the desk behind, in the black and white photo, there's a desk behind the window there, and the person who is running the desk is facing this way. We turned that 90 degrees because they wanted the person to be able to look into the vestibule, which is all the way over on the far left in the first slide. Oh, I'm sorry. I have to change. There. Okay. Now the program manager desk is, you can see it's parallel with the wall that we are looking through here, and on the right it is turned 90 degrees. That's the essential information that needs to be known. The wall was pushed back, and we put in an accessible elevator. You can see the brick wall there just on the right-hand side of the slide, and that enables an elevator to come in and move on a skip-stop level, so that a half-stop rather. You either go down a half a level to get into the dining area, or you go up a half a level to get into the living area. So these are the kind of changes that we were making here, and we were making them in a language that we realized was not that different from what Aalto used. So here's one of the major spaces. This is the dining room, and it was called by Aalto the jewel in the crown of the building, and it is a space that is nestled into the serpentine shape of the exterior of the building. And it is, what we had to do was, again, all predicated by building code things. And I think that so what we looked at first was the wall of the balcony, because the wall was too low to meet code without causing danger to children. So we had to raise that, and the question became, how do we raise it? Well, we discovered in going back through the original working drawings that Aalto had actually planned for this building to be, to have a full height wall with no top rail on it, and just a big heavy wall cap, because he wanted privacy between the balcony area at the top and the main dining area below. What we did is we tried a number of mock-ups and came up with kind of a compromise where we conserved the original woodwork on these walls. We demolished it, raised it up to the required height, left a gap, and rebuilt it that way. And again, there's been some controversy about whether or not that is, you know, we're trying to fool people into think that that's what Aalto might have done. But the alternative was to do something like add either a fence or a piece of glass or something like that, and none of them, all of them really diminished the space in a very significant way. So we felt that this was a way to honor what Aalto did originally, to make the necessary adjustments, and to just try to do it in as discreet a fashion as possible. The other thing you see is that looking at the skylights there, on the left, they're all just sitting in a plaster ceiling, whereas on the right, you'll see that there's a wood slat infill ceiling. We had to put a lot of mechanical equipment above that ceiling, and we found drawings for the building that showed actually a wood ceiling just like that. It was simply never executed for cost reasons. And so, but we felt that it was now, given the fact that there was all this new equipment being put up there that would need access, and these are accessible wooden panels that you can move aside, that making that introduction would make this work. And so it did, and we put it in, and it's, again, given it looks like a lot of other Aalto buildings that use a similar kind of system, but it's not something that was original to this building. So you might quibble as to whether or not there was a possible other alternative. We couldn't find one. We also wanted to activate the roof. Aalto was very big on habitable roofscapes. On the left is the Paimio Sanatorium, which was, of course, for tuberculosis patients, so they created this sunlit space at the top of the building for the use of the patients. What you see on the right is a similar kind of, it's a working drawing of the south facade and the roof, and it shows these trellises coming up, which were meant to climb the curved wall, but it also shows a dotted outline of a concrete slab that was to be a roof enclosure, give the building a horizontal cap, and to create a protected area for the roof. Again, we looked at a lot of precedents. This is a sketch by Eino Aalto that was done showing a trellis on the roof, and also showing a new room configuration when they had to extend the building. But they also, on the right-hand side, what we did was built a lot of models and tested this and looked at the possibility for what might really make this building sing, and also to reactivate the roof in an intelligent way. And again, here's another view of that model from another side, and then finally what was built on the roof. We had to do an addition to the housemaster's suite, which you see here. And again, we tried to make it look contemporary. We used a slightly different material palette, though we did use the same brick where we built brick, and to differentiate. And then the final thing on the exterior is the stucco that you see there on the right. Restoring that was the subject of great controversy, because we discovered in the course of our research that Aalto originally wanted to tile that facade, but there were actually very good reasons why the tile would fail. And the contractor went to MIT, the client, and said, look, we won't guarantee this. So MIT came back and said, you have to change this to something that the contractor will guarantee. So they put up the stucco, and the stucco actually was it was a very good system, and it wore very well, and given the lightweight nature of the way in which this wall was framed, it actually was a very good solution, because I have seen similar installations where these tiles have popped off. They are actually very hard to control in this kind of climate. So we merely restored the stucco. We changed the color ever so slightly to make it the color of the terracotta tile that he was originally going to try, but otherwise left it alone. We made other fairly subtle changes to the interior, mostly with the lighting, and then introducing systems upstairs behind wood soffits. But it was otherwise really a manner of just sort of flushing this out and restoring this building to what Aalto wanted, with as little apparent change as possible. And I'm going to close with this slide of a couple things. One is the Chrono-Chaos installation by Rem Koolhaas, which he made in New York some years ago. And what this is all about was the idea that he had written a little manifesto called Preservation is Overtaking Us. And the other images that were on that slide were of Frank Gehry's Stata Center at MIT. That building is undergoing a comprehensive conservation management program right now. And the reason is because there are inevitably changes that need to be made to the building. There's a lot of maintenance that needs to be done. And MIT wants this done in a systematic and thoroughly thought through fashion. But the building's only 18 years, excuse me. The building is 18 years old. And so I think it's safe to say what Koolhaas is predicting is that we're going to be embedding preservation guidelines into our construction documents as we go out to tender for projects when they are first built. And you know, that's actually not such a bad idea. So I think with that, I will open it up for the panel for questions. Okay.
I'm very happy now to segue into a panel discussion, and for that I welcome Kirtida Unwala and Rahul Mehrotra. A brief introduction to both. Kirtida Unwala graduated from the Bandra School of Art in '79 and is a recipient of the Charles Wallace India Trust Scholarship for specialized training in architectural conservation from the De Montfort University at Leicester. She has acquired specialized training in structural and material conservation at the School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. In private practice since 1983, she has coordinated and undertaken consultancy projects concerning restoration of historic buildings, including structural and architectural restoration, adaptive reuse, urban area analysis, and documentation studies. Amongst her significant buildings that she has worked on for restoration are the Ismail building at Flora Fountain, the Afghan church at Kulaba, and the Jama Masjid at Crawford Market. Rahul Mehrotra is the founder principal of RMA Architects based in Mumbai and Boston, and professor of urban design and planning at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Mehrotra has been actively involved in civic and urban affairs in Mumbai, having served on commissions for historic preservation and environmental issues with various NGOs and civic groups. He was executive director of the Urban Design Research Institute and is now a trustee. Mehrotra is a member of the steering committee of the Lakshmi Mittal South Asia Institute at Harvard. He's also a founding member of the board of the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, Bengaluru. Mehrotra has taught at the University of Michigan and at the School of Architecture and Urban Planning at MIT. So I welcome all our panelists, and we will just kind of jump into the discussion. I think the best thing we could do is perhaps ask both our panelists, Kirti and Rahul, to make a few statements as observations to the lecture that we have just heard, and then maybe we can take forward some ideas from that. So may I ask you, Kirti, to maybe start and give us your impressions about the lecture that we have just heard.
My good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for being invited here. It was a huge pleasure to listen to this talk on the modern architecture, modern historic architecture. And the term modern in historic itself has been a muse. So the take that I would have, I've never worked on so far pure modern architecture so far. And therefore the journey that I understood from the session is huge. The best part of the journey was the manner in which the two charters were mentioned and its translation into application to the modern, especially the kind of manner in which the value for change was highlighted. Because there has always been a question for our entire fraternity of conservation architects for this issue of change. How much of change in the context of the existing, the value of which, the cultural significance value of which is already identified. And the pleasure also comes from the disclosures that were made in the context of change that was discussed, because those contexts normally are not discussed in open forums, at least as far as in my experience in this city or in this country. So it is always a welcome to understand the manner in which change is involved, the defense for change is involved and the justifications in which this is catered to. So looking at the charters, both the charters that were mentioned, Bara, as well as all the other charters that were mentioned, it brings in a lot of context as a theory application and also as kind of writing down these applications. So the last word that was mentioned by David here was that it is worthwhile to use the experience to bring them down into writing down these experiences as possibly manner in which change was applied. So that is a take that I would have in this session.
Yeah, is this working? No. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Kirti. Thanks, David, for that talk. No, just a couple of reflections and maybe to get you to respond, things that maybe we are struggling with here. First of all, I just want to extend what you said about Rem Koolhaas, and because we've had many conversations in classes about this, which is that, I think is conservation or preservation getting ahead of us? You framed it as that we would need to, in our construction documents, almost begin to codify. But another read of that, or an extension, or another sort of way of looking at it, is I think what Rem Koolhaas was provoking, which is interesting, is that preservation is getting ahead of us, which means that now we are conserving 8-year-old buildings. And so, from the time that the object that we were concerned about conserving was built 150 years before the moment that we had an impulse as society to conserve it, is now shrinking. And he was almost arguing that in the future, when you go for building sanctions, one of the boxes you'll have to tick is, will this building be preserved in the future? Which means then you can build it in a way that it can be preserved for a long time. Otherwise, you don't have the onus on worrying about materials and other things, and you can engineer it with life cycles of materials which are much lower. It's an interesting thought, which means it forces us then as society to begin to codify what we want to codify as for preservation in the future, which means what are the buildings in which we're going to embody our own memories for the future. So it's like quite a bizarre thought, but an interesting one to think about. The other thing I wanted to kind of say, which I thought was very interesting, I think what was lovely about your lecture was, you broke it into these 3 or 4 parts, which is clarifying what modernity is and modernism, and then how one, I think you talked about this of society, technology, and space, and then you grounded it for us in the Indian and South Asian context, which I kind of want to come back to for a second, because this is your first time in India, and you're already beginning to see the complexities and the nuances with which life surrounds us here. And then you showed us cases in the West, but also 2 of the buildings you've done. And it's interesting that both in the Louis Kahn building and in the Alto building, you almost went back to original intention. In a sense, you found it as an opportunity to go back. And a lot of it was about upgrading these buildings without impinging on the kind of architectural illusion, which is how do you bring services in, how do you introduce a RAM, and for me it's interesting. Our practice is 30 years old, and one of our first buildings from 1994, 5, 6. We've just been called back to do a conservation report on it 30 years later. And I realized the building's in good shape, and most of the demands were upgradation in terms of new technologies, uses, and things. And so I think that's an interesting clarification, because it's an opportunity to address those simultaneously, right? Because upgrading is not just material conservation, but in this case, its use and its relevance for the future, also for older buildings. The other 2 points I wanted to make, just to ground it, for us as an audience, for Kirti to respond to, is, I remember starting to work here on conservation in the early 90s and 95, we were leading up to the legislation. I remember meeting bureaucrats, and I remember going into government offices and things, and people who, I was in my very early 30s and there were people in their 60s, and the first reaction was, are you crazy? Why do you want to conserve colonial buildings, right? I mean, this is about oppression. It's what are we kind of celebrate? Of course, it takes 2 generations to appreciate assets like that. And it always made me think how the narratives, and that was part of the, well, not problem, but part of, I think, the discomfort I had, not with Kirti, but with many architects who bought narratives directly from the British kind of narratives here, from English heritage and things. And I always struggled with it. And the Bharat Charter, I think the Nara and Bharat Charter, I'm glad you brought them up, is actually began to bring the intangible, began to expand what authenticity would be. It began to create a more nuanced framework by which we could look at what's relevant, right? And so it made me frame the question as, when the creators of, especially in post-colonial conditions, when the creators of an environment are different from the custodians of the environment. As for us, the British created this and we are the custodians. Can we use the same narrative? So the narratives of nostalgia, I mean, if Queen Victoria touched a piece of stone is not important for me. For someone in Britain, they would think that's important enough to conserve it, right? So what are the narratives you apply? And I think what the Bharat Charter and all do is allow you to expand the definitions of cultural significance as also dynamic with the intangible, etc. So it complicates, it makes our life as architects very difficult, because you have to you can bring new use, but you have to keep the illusion of architecture intact, which is what we all are after. So when it comes to modern architecture, I'm sorry, this is the last point, but I wanted to frame it with this background. It's interesting because let's say that in the context of South Asia, Latin America, Africa, aesthetic modernity arrived here before the social modernization project, right? It came in through political impulses, ideological ones. It came in through very charismatic, talented architects of that generation who could bring this seamlessly in on the back of Corbusier, Nehru's patronage and all of that. And in Africa and Latin America, it was the same story. So there's a kind of disjuncture, because in Europe, aesthetic modernity came out of the social modernization. Right? It was a natural extension of a cultural representation through architecture of a social modernization process. So we have a real disjuncture. And I think that's partly why we also struggle with modern buildings. They don't mean the same thing. We, as a culture, have an impulse to adorn, to ornament. That's why Art Deco was so brilliant, because it walked that fine line between the impulse to adorn and modern architecture, is severe in that sense. And so when we struggle with it here, David and I would be curious, maybe at the end of your trip, to, your reflections, and I don't know what Kirti thinks of this, is the question beyond society, technology and space, is constituency in who wants to conserve this and why. And there's a kind of macro dimension to it. So I'm going to take 3 examples very quickly. The Hall of Nations got demolished. Who spoke up for it? The Delhi Urban Arts Commission and the people who are on that board. Intact, maybe, right? And a fringe elite in some ways that for other reasons thinks it's important. But there's no real constituency for the Hall of Nations. It meant, what citizens went and saw some fairs there, but it didn't stay with them, right? In a sense, I think that's why it was a fringe discussion, unfortunately. I was completely distraught at that destruction. In the IIM is interesting because it was local patronage, which was the mill-owning families, enlightened Sarabhais, Lalbhais, all of that. And it was fabulous engagement by Louis Kahn, and there's a lot in the archives of how he interacted with local bricklayers, craftspeople to build this. And then they are the users. And who is reacting to it now is an international elite, rightly so, and a local elite of architects. But that discussion, even within the city of Ahmedabad, has had no traction. No, it's really interesting to think about it like that. And so what does sort of that mean? On the other hand, the Kala Academy, which is in Goa, perhaps a very significant building, but not Charles Correa's most significant building. But within the context of Goa, every music-loving Goa, which is 98.9% of them, have gone there, either have had piano lessons, they have gone to concerts. So suddenly there were 30, 50,000 people putting in petitions to save the building, and the High Court even stopped the stay on the demolition, right? So there was a constant. Now, whether it'll get done, whether the PWD can do it is a different matter. But it occurs to me that with modern architecture in the South Asian context and maybe in the non-Western context, there are many other complications. I think in the case of the United States or Europe, there's a different relationship society has to it. And I think that's the bigger struggle. And of course, technology, society, use, all that is there. But I just think the idea of what is the appropriate narrative that one can develop for different pieces of modern architecture here is going to be the greatest challenge if the profession has to give this some traction. So I'd just be curious to hear your reflections on it.
Thank you. Thank everyone. It's hard for me to place myself completely sort of body, heart, and soul within that context. I've spent a reasonable amount of time outside of the Western world, but not that much. And it's certainly not part of my my own cultural upbringing, and so I don't want to pretend I'm something I'm not. However, I do think that there are the perception and the use of a building or I think a lot of it has to do. I mean, certainly I do understand oppressive structures, oppressive spaces, and why people would not want to worry about conserving them, and why there may be very good reasons to tear them down and start over again. But I think we are perhaps naively, but certainly trying to instill to in a way detach in areas. I mean, obviously the most egregious examples of buildings and spaces that carry very negative cultural connotations need to be addressed on that level. But I think for a lot of it, it is just simply they are associated with either a period or a place or whatever it may be in ways that make it harder to buy into this. And I think what we're trying to do is to say, maybe what you can do is you can recast that meaning somehow. But can't we find a way to repurpose this building so that we're not throwing away millions of tons of embodied carbon and that sort of thing? And of course, you have to get people to buy into the climate change crisis, which is very big among certain people, probably more in the West than elsewhere. I recognize that as well. But it is nonetheless a social and environmental imperative. And I think that that trying as much as possible to work on that level rather than saying this is an important cultural monument and I'm sorry you don't like it, but we need to preserve its memory. It isn't just about memory in this case. It's about the physical facts of the building and being able to look at that almost as a natural thing, almost as something that is part of the natural environment and needs to be conserved in the way that you conserve anything else in the natural environment. I mean, that may be pushing it and may be getting out on a limb, but I think you raise a very provocative question with that.
Yeah, sort of respond to this because no, but I think that's a wonderful answer because I mean, I think that is the narrative of relevance. So when we talk about conservation, I mean, of course, there's a whole science to it, which is the material conservation aspect, right? So I mean, that's critical. But how does one use that instrumentally within a narrative that can engage more people? And I think your answer is a great one, which is that the new narratives are about embodied energy, sustainability, about in the context of climate change, which is, I mean, we had someone do a studio last year at the GST, which was a whole studio on a monetarium on building, which is supposing on this planet, we collectively decided we won't build a single new building and just readapt everything. She did a whole studio on this, and it was a really fascinating studio in what it brought up, because actually there's enough resources on this planet to just reuse material and accommodate people in redundant buildings through reuse, etc. So those narratives become the critical narratives. And so this points to pedagogy in the context of a school of architecture. To say this is that you know, I think by also, so specializations are very important because of the integrity of a discipline. But then how those specializations, whether it's urban design or conservation, can sit within broader frameworks becomes a real challenge for pedagogy in the future if we have to address, I think, David, what you're outlining. As they say, conservation is an instrument of planning to modulate the rate of change, and every society can take a rate of change. The Chinese at one point, after the Cultural Revolution, could take anything. Now they can't. They're slowing down. You know, Indians can take change like in a flash because we believe in rebirth, reincarnation, cyclic time. I don't know what the reasons would be. So every society is different. And so if conservation is but one instrument of planning and gets re-embedded in that broader framework, even in pedagogical terms, I think these are the things that would make a shift and connect it to what you're saying.
Do you want to add some?
So to continue from there, when the decisions are taken to conserve, the very meaning of conservation itself is, I think, not embedded as much as it should have been. And when you take the case of Mumbai, which we all know, in fact, you started with it. And today we know that the sustainability goals that have been advocated throughout the world, and the G20 summit, which is advertised all over the city like nobody's business. And then where does it lead? Where does it all lead? Is there any sensitization which is accruing from this idea of sustainability? So that is not happening. In fact, Mumbai, I would say now, and I have been involved very late in life, but with the Heritage Committee today, and also with the Auditing Committee, which happened 5 years back, where does Mumbai stand in the listing? You know what has happened to Mumbai today? I don't know if it has come out as stark as I'm going to say it, is that the list is frozen today and for never to resurrect. And how many buildings, yes, and how many modern buildings have been inculcated. We have the game changers in the city, like the practice of GBK. And are those buildings listed? I think most of them are not. Today I was looking up the list of these game changers, architects who came into the city to change the entire idea, even beyond Art Deco. And where are they? Where are those buildings listed? And when the list is frozen by design, then where does it go? And I think that's the same scenario in the whole country. So if that is it, then where does GA20 stand and where is SDG in this whole practice? So when you say that you have to consider these buildings which have been built as natural assets, then natural assets ideally should be grade 1. Are they grade 1 even in this city, which was a pioneer of listing of buildings and listing of assets in the whole country? So I remember Harshad Bhatia years ago had kind of had a premonition, and he said that the heritage movement in this city took place, went about 10 steps ahead, and we were very proud of it. Today it is 10,000 steps behind. If you look at the new DCR, it has taken away the entire, the crucial rights of the experts who sit on these committees, taken away the right to even change it a bit. So the DCR has changed it completely. And so the hands are tied of these experts. So that is...
As you said that, 10,000 steps back, just an anecdote. You know, as you know, I was on the Heritage Committee for many years, and my 5th, 6th year, there was a meeting when I realized that something had changed, because there was a developer who came in and they were proposing a new building in a grade 3 where you could demolish, but what you had to build had to be compatible with the fabric, right? That was what the code allowed. And he came with a building that was about 30 stories high, and we said this is not compatible by the DCRs of grade 3. So he came back for the next meeting a month later with the same high-rise building, but he had made all the windows arches. And so we said, I mean, you know, we told you. He said, no, I've put heritage into it. So, you know, so heritage is then used in a kind of very bizarre, and then one realized that the other pressures are taking over in the city, and we don't have the tools to resist them almost, you know, as narratives and other things. I don't know. It's a bigger conversation, but we should open it up for David for the...
Okay.
Yeah, so I'd like to open up to the audience. If there are any questions from your side, then maybe you can just stand up and speak up. Our mics are acting funny this way. We have one useful mic on this side. Yeah. Anyone? At the back.
I just want to warn you, she's a conservation.
You were in a position like that, when you were dealing with a very historic element of modern architecture. How would you approach?
Well, certainly the first thing you need to do, I think you have a moral responsibility to get rid of the hazardous material. Unless it's salvageable, and you can just leave it alone and not touch it, and it's not friable. Meaning, you know, it's not dropping pieces down on people. Stable, exactly. But personally, I think that probably the better solution is to find a substitute material that works just as well, and hopefully could also be done on a budget. I mean, what you don't want to have to do is spend just enormous sums of money getting some bespoke material up there that's going to look just like that old material. I think that I can't visualize. I mean, I know the building, but I can't visualize the exact place you're saying, because so it's a little hard to say. But philosophically, I am perfectly happy to make the change and to put in something that hopefully would even do a better job in terms of the acoustic performance, and that reflect. I mean, I think one of the things that's so poetic about so many of Le Corbusier's buildings is that there is a very raw quality about them, and I think you want to maintain that. What you don't want to do is make anything seem precious, but you have to do it with sensitivity. Sometimes that's harder to do than to just do something very luxurious. Does that make sense?
The acoustics is hay in gunny bags that Corbusier put against the wall and put clouds on top of it, and it's lasted for 60 years.
Oh, I missed that part. Okay.
And that's lasted for 60 years, hay in gunny bags. Will you do that again, or would you look at?
No, I would probably not use a material that is going to sort of dry up and deteriorate the way hay does, but is more stable. But the idea, again, you know, of just using burlap sacks in order to do that, I think it's brilliant. You know, I think that's part of the spirit of the building that I think, you know, I mean, it's just the opposite of what so many capital complexes, where you have gold leaf and marble and all of these precious materials. And what is special about these buildings is precisely the sort of spareness of the material that was used. Yes, in the back.
What is the process of dwelling into the archive? Is that something you do right to start with?
Yeah, okay. No, that's part of a systematic approach to conservation that I like to take on every project. I mean, the first thing you do is research. For instance, for the Louis Kahn building at University of Pennsylvania, I had already spent the better part of a week in the archives before I even got the job, because I thought that if I made it clear to the interview committee that I already knew this building very well, I understood what the records were, I was starting to think about ways in which you could approach this that were appropriate given the history of the building. That means a lot. It also makes you, it means it increases your options, and it eliminates the possibility that you're going to miss something terrible about the building. And part of it is the understanding, part of it is pure technical knowledge, and part of it is simply looking like if you need to access probes, if you need to find hidden conditions that may be given problems for the building, those are all things that will become apparent to you as you are doing this research. But the primary thing is to really understand how the building came to be. And in understanding how it came to be, you also start to develop your own methodology for how it should be altered and enhanced, and how that can dialogue with what that is. I mean, obviously, this has a lot more meaning on a real heritage building like the Richards Labs. It might be less so on a typical apartment block from 50 or 60 years ago that you're working on. But even there, I mean, I think with any building, there's great value in doing that research. And it should always be the place you start before you make proposals for what you're going to do with the building.
I just sort of know, I think that was a great question. Thank you for it. And just to extend what you're saying, in a sense, I think we have the advantage in more contemporary buildings to have these archives. Imagine if we had archives on the Mughal buildings and buildings that were even older, we might think about it differently. And I was really struck by the example, I didn't know about that, of the Alto building, where they found that there was a wooden ceiling, right? Now, I mean, as we all know who practice architecture, I mean, a building is a process. There are a series of compromises. There are a series of mismatches between users, as in the case of the Richards Lab, and the patrons who might be calling the shots in terms of the decisions that are made. And actually understanding those slippages and understanding where the compromises occurred actually give you the clues where the problems lie also. I mean, in that way, the opening up of the corners, the opening up of space to create, that's why that quote, Inga Saffron, who's a well-known critic, her quotation that David used is that now it's working like Louis Kahn had imagined it would work. And so, I mean, I think your question is a very important one, because in modern buildings, especially, let's say this in the last century, I think understanding that process might hold incredible clues, even in the way you might approach the conservation project, as we saw in at least the Richards Lab and the Alto building. That was clear.
Yes, and I just have to, I can't leave without apologizing. There was a very crucial slide in the Alto show that slipped and disappeared, and I apologize for that, because you never really got the sense of the serpentine bar, and suffice that. But yes, it is it was the same thing with the Alto building. We went to Finland. We weren't satisfied with just looking at the drawings in Boston where they were still housed in the firm that was Alto's executive architect for the project, and they did the working drawings. But we went to Finland. We interviewed Alto's assistants. One advantage to doing modern buildings is they're younger, and you can still find people who are alive who had something to do very often with the production of the original. The whole reason when we were doing the Alto building, for instance, the thing about the railing height, the reason we felt good doing it the way we did it is because, besides the fact that we felt it worked, but what his assistant confirmed and found and showed us in writing was Alto's priorities for that space. And what we were doing is we were doing something that honored that. Now you have to be very careful. You don't want to create what a colleague of mine calls seance architecture. You don't want to feel as though you're engaging the spirit of the dead master and channeling his energy. That's not right either. But the more you can understand why because what it is he had an idea for an intention for how that space was meant to be used. It wasn't just how it looked, but how it was meant to be used. And it couldn't be used properly without doing some of these changes. And that's what we honored.
I'd just like to acknowledge here that this event is also being streamed live. So thank you for everyone who is watching us online. We've kind of exceeded our time a little bit. So maybe I can end with a last question which has come from one of the persons watching online. This is from Aditi. And she says that in heritage, we classify things as grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. So how would you classify, or what method should be used to classify modern heritage? And I may just ask, there's another one which has come from Priyanka. ICOMOS India is taking up the listing of 20th century heritage in several cities through their National Scientific Committee. Is there a possibility to add this to the existing heritage list of a city and to make regulations for it? So anyone can kind of answer this, but if I may begin with you, David, how would we classify modern heritage?
Well, I think this is a way, really, in that I think how you treat the heritage is one thing, but I think in terms of the classification, if you're going to use a system of classification, there's no reason why you can't apply it to modern buildings. And in fact, the British are doing that. We're doing it in the United States. It's the French are doing it. It's happening in many countries around the world. I mean, there are clearly, in the same way that buildings, there may be different reasons why you choose to list something grade 1 or 2 or 3, but I think that there are obviously buildings with, you know, that rise culturally for one reason or another above others, and therefore, you know, might merit a grade 1 listing or a grade 2 listing or a grade 3 listing. I think and I think obviously more modern heritage, and maybe even heritage isn't the right word, more modern fabric, more modern buildings probably would fall into the grade 3 category. And but here's where where I think the message needs to be, again, they may be grade 3. That doesn't mean you throw them away. It means you find a way to creatively reuse them. Or if they're not listed at all. I mean, grade 3 generally implies that that's what you're going to do anyway. But I think that there needs to be more of an understanding about what these things mean. I personally find the whole grading system to be somewhat constricting, although I do think it's very useful when you're working, particularly in an environment with multiple buildings, to understand a hierarchy, and you know, where if you're going to make radical change, maybe it's better to make it on the grade 3 building than on the grade 1 building.
The next question was whether ICOMOS listed buildings can be integrated with current.
I don't see why not. I really don't. Again, I think it's very dangerous to make two discrete heritage systems. Modern architecture is different, but it's still part of a broad arc of cultural continuity that philosophically, modernism goes back to the 17th century. And so I think that you have to be careful in making these distinctions. There is, I mean, although the modernists like to think that they broke with history and created forever and other, that's true in some ways, but it's not true in others. And so I do think that it's important to apply the same criteria in listing modern buildings as in traditional, and I don't see any reason why they shouldn't be mixed together.
Well, there are more questions which are coming online, but we are out of time, and I have to apologize to those who have sent in their questions. And I think, now have to bring this lovely event to an end. Let me first and foremost thank you all for being present here for this wonderful and insightful lecture. Let me thank David for giving us so much to think about. And I do hope to the architects in the audience, they can take these ideas further, perhaps in their own practice or in their own advocacy. Thank you also to Rahul and Kirtida for being here, and to all the organizers, and a special shout to you all who have done the technical backup for this event, both for within the room as well as at the level of streaming. So once again, thank you for coming here, and have a very good night.